One Jedi made Darth Sidious afraid. One Jedi broke free from the most powerful Sith mind in history, not once, but twice. One discovered something that changed what death itself means, and did it completely alone, without anyone's permission. And one was so powerful that when he finally fell, it took the combined effort of hundreds of Jedi just to contain what he left behind. These are not legends. These are the historical record. The Jedi Order existed for over 25,000 years. In that time, tens of thousands of knights and masters walked the galaxy, served the Force, and were forgotten. Most of them were extraordinary by any reasonable standard. But a small number of them, a number you can count, operated at a level so far beyond extraordinary that the people around them struggled to find language adequate to what they were witnessing. These are those people. What makes this question harder than it looks is that power in the Force does not come in one shape. The Jedi who survived every fight he was ever in was not necessarily the most powerful. Sometimes the most powerful ones lost. Sometimes they died young. Sometimes they gave everything they had in a single moment that nobody saw. The Force does not hand out rewards for raw strength. It does something far more interesting. It reveals what a person is made of, and then it asks if that is enough. Tonight, across the full sweep of the Legends galaxy, deeper, older, and stranger than any single film can contain, we are going to find out who was actually made of the most. Every name on this list earned it in a way that cannot be argued away. And the name at the very top is someone whose story, once you fully understand it, makes the answer feel almost inevitable. We are going through the Legends continuity, the full version, the one that stretches back tens of thousands of years into wars so catastrophic they reshaped civilizations and forward into conflicts the films never touched. This is the story you came for. Let us begin with someone whose power confounded every opponent who ever underestimated him, which was almost all of them. There are Jedi who are powerful because of what they can do, and there are Jedi who are powerful because of who they are. The first kind are impressive. The second kind are genuinely difficult to defeat. And Obi-Wan Kenobi, who stands as one of the great figures at the beginning of this list, belongs firmly and without question to the second category. That distinction matters more than it might first appear, because it explains something that confused his opponents throughout his entire career. He was very rarely the strongest person in the room. He was almost always the most formidable. On a purely technical level, Obi-Wan was one of the greatest lightsaber duelists the Order ever produced. His mastery of Soresu, the third form of lightsaber combat, reached heights that only a small number of practitioners had ever achieved at any point in the Order's long history. Soresu is not a flashy form. It does not win through aggression or speed or overwhelming force. It wins through something considerably more difficult to develop and sustain: stillness, economy, the ability to perceive every attack before it lands and to be exactly where you need to be without wasting a single movement in the process. Soresu, at its highest expression, is almost meditative. It transforms the practitioner into something that resembles a fixed point inside a storm, completely present, absorbing everything thrown at it, waiting with a patience that never becomes passivity for the moment the attacker exhausts themselves against a defense they cannot find a way through. Obi-Wan did not merely practice Soresu. He became its living embodiment, the clearest demonstration the galaxy had seen in generations of what the form looked like when someone gave themselves to it entirely. Mace Windu, who was himself one of the greatest swordsmen in the Order's history. and a man who did not offer compliments lightly to anyone, once described Obi-Wan as having the most sophisticated grasp of Sorezu he had ever witnessed in a practitioner of any age. That is not a small thing to say. It carries a specific weight coming from Mace Windu. Other masters who observed him in practice and in combat quietly agreed. By the time Obi-Wan reached his prime, he had developed a style of engagement that was genuinely and repeatedly proven to be nearly impossible to defeat through direct confrontation. His defense was so refined that even opponents who exceeded him in raw force power found themselves unable to break through it cleanly. To fight Obi-Wan Kenobi was to discover that you were not fighting a man so much as you were fighting a principle. And principles do not get tired. But Sorezu only begins to describe why Obi-Wan belongs on any serious list of the most powerful Jedi in history. What elevated him beyond technique was the combination of that physical mastery with a clarity of mind that almost no one in the Order ever matched in its completeness. The Jedi Code speaks of serenity, of the calm that allows a practitioner to move through the world without being pulled off center by fear or anger or grief, or the accumulated weight of loss. Most Jedi achieve this in patches. They find serenity in certain areas of their life and continue struggling with it in others. The Code is an ideal they move toward, not a state they inhabit continuously. Obi-Wan was different. He found that center not as an achievement to be maintained, but as a fundamental quality of his character, something he returned to naturally even when the conditions around him were doing everything possible to make it unavailable. Look at what he survived. He watched his master die when he was still a Padawan, then immediately faced and defeated the Sith Lord who had just killed him. That achievement alone is something that should be examined closely, because it is far more remarkable than it tends to get acknowledged as. Darth Maul was a weapon, a being that had been conditioned since childhood to be a perfect instrument of violence, relentlessly trained in the most aggressive combat forms the dark side had developed, carrying a fighting style specifically optimized to overwhelm, demoralize, and destroy Jedi. He had cut down Qui-Gon Jinn, one of the most experienced and capable Jedi of his generation, in a duel where both combatants were at full capacity. And Obi-Wan, young, grieving, operating in the aftermath of watching his master be killed, separated from his weapon, and pushed into a containment pit, dug something out of himself that he had not yet had a full lifetime to develop, reached into the Force with a clarity that should not have been accessible to someone in that condition, and came back from that pit to win. That single moment tells you almost everything you need to know about the quality of person Obi-Wan Kenobi fundamentally was. Then came the Clone Wars, a decade of grinding conflict that would have broken most people, and that did, in fact, break a number of Jedi who were no less committed than Obi-Wan to the principles they had sworn to uphold. He served on the front lines of one of the most devastating military campaigns in galactic history. He watched the Republic twist itself into something unrecognizable. He engaged separatist commanders and dark side warriors repeatedly and at close range throughout the conflict, absorbing loss after loss at the strategic level, while somehow maintaining his own internal coherence through all of it. He fought Grievous. He fought Ventress multiple times. He fought Dooku. He survived every encounter. And through every encounter, he remained the same person who had stepped onto those catwalks on Naboo as a Padawan, fundamentally unchanged in his values, his clarity, his commitment to the Force as he understood it. His duel with Anakin Skywalker on Mustafar is one of the most analyzed battles in Jedi history for very good reasons. Anakin, at that point, had fallen completely to the dark side and was operating at a level of raw force power that exceeded almost anything the Order had encountered in living memory. He was physically stronger than Obi-Wan. He was faster, he was more aggressive, he was driven by a dark side intensity that added layers of power to every movement. By any conventional measure of a Force duel, Anakin should have won that fight. The reason he did not win is the reason Obi-Wan Kenobi belongs on this list. Not power, wisdom. Obi-Wan understood the geometry of that fight with a precision that Anakin's dark side-fueled certainty was preventing him from seeing. He understood the terrain, the angles, what was physically achievable from where each of them was standing, and what was not. He waited. He chose his moment with the patience of a man who had spent his entire adult life learning how to wait. And when the moment arrived, he ended it. Then he went into exile and waited 19 more years, watching, carrying the memory of everything he had built and everything he had lost, protecting a child who did not know he was being protected. And when he returned, he faced a being that had grown into something even more formidable than the young man he had once known. And he faced it without fear, made a choice only someone of his specific quality of character could have made, and became something that could not be silenced, even by death. The Force does not give that kind of continuity to ordinary practitioners. Returning as a coherent, communicating presence through the Force after the body is gone requires a connection so deep and so completely realized that physical death cannot unravel it. Obi-Wan built that connection over an entire lifetime of unrelenting practice, not through dramatic demonstrations of power, but through the quiet, daily commitment to being exactly what the Force needed him to be, in every circumstance, without exception and without complaint. He was not the most powerful Jedi who ever lived in the sense of raw Force capacity, but there is a very real argument that he was the most complete, and completeness, achieved and sustained across the full length of an extraordinary life, is a form of power that the other kinds cannot quite match. The next name on this journey requires a different kind of attention, because his legacy is not primarily a story of combat or survival. It is a story about a single idea that one man believed deeply enough to follow all the way to the end and beyond, an idea that changed what the Force was understood to be capable of, and that sent a chain of consequences forward through generations of Jedi who never knew his name. Qui-Gon Jinn is frequently misread by casual students of Jedi history. He is described as the Jedi who was too stubborn for the Council, the maverick who defied convention, the man who found Anakin Skywalker and set the prequel tragedy in motion. All of that is true. None of it captures what was actually remarkable about him. Because Qui-Gon was not a great Jedi who happened to have unconventional opinions. He was a visionary operating so far ahead of the Order's understanding that the institution he devoted his life to genuinely did not have the framework to evaluate what he was doing. What he discovered, quietly, largely without institutional support, without recognition during his lifetime, and without the benefit of anyone who could fully see what he was working toward, turned out to be one of the most significant contributions to Jedi understanding in the Order's entire history. Most Jedi in the era of the Late Republic understood the Force as having two primary aspects: the living Force, which was the Force as it moved through all living things in the immediate present, the breathing and sensing and feeling of the world around you as it exists right now, and the cosmic force, which was the larger pattern, the deeper current, the force as it operated across history and destiny, and the web of all that existed across all time. These two aspects were understood as related but fundamentally distinct. The living force was what you touched when you reached out in a quiet room and felt the heartbeats of the beings near you. The cosmic force was something more abstract and removed, the subject of prophecy and philosophy rather than direct experience. Most practitioners worked with the living force as their primary connection and treated the cosmic force as something beyond ordinary reach, to be contemplated but not truly touched. Qui-Gon had come to believe that this understanding was wrong. Not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way that was limiting every Jedi who accepted it. His deepest conviction, developed over decades of observation and practice that set him completely apart from his contemporaries, was that the living force and the cosmic force were not truly distinct phenomena. They were two expressions of a single underlying reality. And a Jedi who learned to bridge them would discover something the Order had never imagined possible. Not just enhanced perception or heightened awareness, a form of continuity that extended through and beyond death itself. He believed, with the certainty of someone who had been listening to the Force long enough to trust what it was telling him, that consciousness could persist in the Force after the body died. Not as a faint echo or a residual impression that faded over time, as a genuine, coherent, communicating presence. A Jedi who had fully unified their awareness with the Force could, in theory, return. The Council respected him. They also did not know what to do with him. And the offer of a seat on the Council, which would have been the clearest institutional signal that they had decided to take his vision seriously, he declined. He did not decline out of arrogance or resentment. He declined because accepting would have meant committing to the Council's way of seeing things, and he was not willing to do that. He had a different path. The Force was showing him something, and he trusted that more than he trusted the collective wisdom of masters who had not been listening for the same things he had. His combat ability deserves acknowledgement alongside his philosophical significance, because Qui-Gon was not a man who spent his life contemplating abstractions and neglecting the practical. He was a practitioner first. His style drew heavily from Ataru, the fourth form, which favors explosive, acrobatic movement and force-amplified agility, but filtered through a physical intelligence and an improvisational quality that made him genuinely difficult to anticipate. More than technique, what made Qui-Gon formidable in a fight was his connection to the living Force. He did not fight through calculation. He flowed. He moved the way a current moves, reading the Force with a sensitivity so developed that he was often responding to attacks before they had fully formed in his opponent's mind. To fight Qui-Gon was, by the accounts of those who experienced it, to feel that your opponent had already made peace with every possible version of this moment and was simply inhabiting whichever one the Force directed him toward. His recognition of Anakin Skywalker was the most famous expression of that sensitivity. Not just the midi-chlorian count, though that number stopped every Jedi who heard it in their tracks. What he felt when he encountered that child on Tatooine was something that bypassed measurement entirely. The living Force practically announced itself in Anakin's presence, and Qui-Gon's decades of refined attention to that frequency meant he heard it clearly when everyone around him was still trying to process the data. He staked his reputation, his relationship with the Council, his entire standing within the institution, he had served his whole life on his conviction that this child was the chosen one and had to be trained. He did this because he trusted the Force over the institution. He was right. He paid for being right with his life on the plasma generator catwalks of Theed, separated from Obi-Wan by a containment field. Facing Darth Maul alone in a moment of accumulated exhaustion, his blade found him, and that seemed to be the end. It was not the end, it was the proof, because what Qui-Gon had spent his life working toward was not theoretical after all. He became, in his death, the demonstration of his own hypothesis. He was the first Jedi in the known history of the Order to retain a coherent identity after death and return as a communicating presence in the Force. The process took time and required guidance from beings who existed at the deepest intersection of the Force's nature, the Force priestesses on the wellspring of life, who recognized what he was and helped him complete what he had started. Through this stubborn, visionary, profoundly solitary figure whom the Council never quite knew what to do with, the knowledge of how to survive death was preserved and passed forward through the tradition. He passed it to Yoda. Yoda carried it to Obi-Wan. And through that chain, every Jedi who ever appeared as a Force ghost, every voice that ever guided a student from beyond the boundary of death, every moment where someone who had died continued to shape the living world, owed that possibility to Qui-Gon Jinn. He did not change a battle. He did not save a government. He changed what the Force itself was understood to be capable of. And he did it alone, without the Council's approval, because he trusted what he sensed more than he trusted what everyone around him was willing to accept. That is not ordinary Jedi work. That is the work of someone who was genuinely, fundamentally ahead of where the understanding of an ancient and highly trained order had managed to reach. And it was accomplished by a man who, at the time of his death, still did not have a seat on the Council. If Qui-Gon represents the power of a singular idea pursued beyond all institutional constraint, the next name on this list represents something different entirely. Something rarer. A gift so strategically significant, so completely without precedent in the Order's recent memory, that the Republic's Senate discussed her by name in closed military briefings. A Jedi whose abilities were not primarily about personal combat power, but about the capacity to reach through the Force and change the conditions of war itself at the scale of hundreds of thousands of combatants simultaneously. Bastila Shan was born into the Old Republic era, thousands of years before Qui-Gon walked the galaxy, in a time when the galaxy was different and the Force moved through its civilizations in ways that had not yet calcified into the patterns of the later order. She came into the Jedi Temple young, identified early for a technique so rare it appears only a handful of times in the entire history of Force users, and she was shaped from that early age to be its practitioner. The technique is called battle meditation. The archives describe it as a Force ability that enhances allied coordination and morale, while sowing confusion and weakening the will of enemy forces. That description is technically accurate and profoundly inadequate. It makes battle meditation sound like a supportive tool, something that provides a modest advantage, the Force equivalent of better equipment or superior training. What Bastila Shan could do with battle meditation was not in the same category as modest. She could change the outcome of fleet engagements involving hundreds of thousands of combatants. Not tip the balance slightly. Change the outcome. Battles that military analysts had assessed as near-certain Republic defeats became Republic victories because Bastila was somewhere in the vicinity. Focused, channeling the Force through every being on both sides of the engagement. The pilots in their starfighters moved with a coordination that seemed uncanny to their opponents, reacting to threats before they fully materialized, holding formations under pressure that should have broken them. Ground troops moved with a unity that disoriented Sith commanders trained to exploit chaos. On the opposing side, soldiers who should have been pressing a decisive advantage began to feel something wrong and difficult to name. A creeping sense that the fight had already shifted, that the momentum they thought they had was less real than it had felt a moment ago. This was not illusion, and it was not coincidence. The Force, flowing through Bastila with a scale and precision that no other known practitioner had achieved, was reorganizing the lived conditions of the conflict below the threshold of conscious awareness. The Republic military understood, without romanticism, that Bastila Shan was one of the most important strategic assets in the galaxy during her active years. Not the greatest fighter, not the most powerful in direct combat, but in terms of what her presence or absence meant for the conduct of an actual war, she was worth more to Republic command than entire fleets. This extraordinary gift did not make her life easy. The Jedi Order identified it early and built her development around it, which meant she grew up defined by her function in a way that would have been psychologically difficult for anyone to experience cleanly. She was not primarily developed as a person who happened to have a remarkable ability. She was primarily developed as an instrument who happened to be a person. The discipline that required, the particular isolation of being the most strategically significant individual in every room you ever entered, left marks on her character that she carried into adulthood. She was proud. She was sometimes brittle. She held herself to standards that occasionally tipped from high into rigid. These were not character flaws in the ordinary sense. They were the natural consequences of a childhood spent being told, in every way short of explicitly, that you were too important to be ordinary. Her lightsaber skills were not negligible. She was trained with serious investment and could handle the great majority of threats she would encounter in her work. But the duel that defined her life had nothing to do with lightsaber technique. During the Jedi Civil War, Bastila was part of the strike team that boarded Darth Revan's flagship at the critical moment when Darth Malak turned against his own master and fired on the bridge to destroy them both. In the chaos that followed, with Revan's body shattered and his consciousness drifting toward the Force, with the looseness of a person close enough to death that most observers would not have seen a reason to attempt what came next, Bastila reached for him. She poured herself into stabilizing him, holding him to life through the Force with a strength of will and depth of connection that her battle meditation had trained her to sustain across vast distances and through enormous chaos. She succeeded in keeping him alive, and in doing so, she created, accidentally and entirely without intending to, a force bond between herself and the man she had saved. A deep, genuine connection that would define the remainder of both their lives. The Jedi Council wiped Revan's memory and sent him out with a new identity, using him to find the ancient Rakatan superweapon, the Starforge that Malak had seized. Bastila went with him as his companion and his unknowing anchor. The person whose bond to him was the thread connecting the man he had been reconstructed as to the man he had actually been. That journey took them both to places that neither had been prepared for. When Malak captured her and subjected her to the sustained torture, the Sith had always understood as a reliable way to find the cracks in a person's philosophy. The dark side found what it had been looking for. She fell. The gift that had been the Republic's greatest Force-based strategic advantage became its most devastating liability. Fleets that Bastila's battle meditation had sustained through years of grueling engagement began to collapse. The coordination, the morale, the sense of rightness that had characterized Republic military operations under her influence inverted into its opposite. The war turned in a matter of campaigns. What brought her back was not argument or instruction. It was the Force bond. Revan, who had recovered his true identity through the journey he had taken with her and the companions who had gathered around them, reached through their connection and refused to release her. The bond she had created by saving his life became the instrument of her own salvation in return. Her redemption was not a passive act. It required her to choose, under the direct pressure of the dark side she had been serving, and against the master who had spent months breaking her down into compliance, to turn her battle meditation against Malak's fleet at the moment the final engagement hung in the balance. Against the darkness she had just been a part of, against the being who had made her a part of it. The strength that required had nothing to do with Force power in the conventional sense. It was the strength of a person choosing to be who they actually were after a long and terrible process had tried to persuade them they were someone else entirely. Bastila Shan did not emerge from the Jedi Civil War unchanged. No one who lived through it did. But she emerged from it, having demonstrated something this list will return to several more times before we are finished. That the rarest gifts in the Force are also the heaviest burdens, and that the weight of the gift does not diminish the person who carries it. It reveals them. Long before Bastila, long before even the earliest events of the Old Republic, as historians usually mark its beginning, the galaxy experienced wars that made the conflicts of later centuries look like local disputes. Wars that consumed systems and orders and civilizations entirely. Wars that left scars in the Force itself that persisted for generations after the fighting was done. And it was out of the wreckage of one of those ancient conflicts. Not from the halls of the Jedi Temple or from a childhood carefully shaped toward Force mastery, but from the wreckage of a battle that should by every reasonable account have killed her along with everyone else, that Meetra Surik emerged. To understand why Meetra Surik belongs on this list, you first have to understand what she survived. Because what she survived should not have been survivable, and the specific and unprecedented way in which she managed to survive it tells you something fundamental about the nature of her connection to the Force. The Battle of Malachor V was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was the moment when the Republic, desperate and exhausted at the end of the Mandalorian Wars, authorized the use of a weapon that no one with any serious understanding of what the Force was should have ever agreed to use in a populated combat zone. The mass shadow generator created a gravitational singularity of sufficient power to destroy everything present simultaneously. Every ship in the space above the planet, every soldier on the surface below, every Mandalorian warrior who had come to fight what they believed would be the final decisive engagement of the war. Every Jedi serving under General Meetra Surik who had no way of knowing the weapon existed until the moment it activated. Meetra gave the order. She was the commanding officer. The decision was hers. She gave it knowing, to whatever degree anyone can know such a thing before the fact, what it would cost. The Force screaming that came from Malachor was not a metaphor. The simultaneous death of thousands of Force-sensitive beings, the Jedi serving under her. The Mandalorian warriors who carried their own connection to the living world, and the ordinary soldiers on both sides, who the Force moved through as it moved through all living things, created a wound in the Force at that location that persisted for years. A rupture. A place where the Force felt wrong in a way that experienced Force users could not approach without physical discomfort. The Jedi who survived the battle walked away, broken, in a manner that had no precedent in the Order's experience. Many found their connection to the Force simply gone, not suppressed or blocked, but absent, as if the trauma of what they had felt in that moment had severed something that could not be reconnected. They became known as the Jedi Wound Force Sensitives, who still existed within the Force but could no longer touch it from the inside. Meetra Surik should have been the most damaged of all of them. She was at the center. She gave the order. She felt every death. Instead, she did something that has no record in Jedi history before or after her. She did not hold on to her connection to the Force when the wave of death and Force screaming hit her. She released it, deliberately, consciously, in the exact moment that holding on would have destroyed her. She let go. She released herself from the Force, or more precisely, she released the Force from herself, surrendering her connection entirely, rather than trying to maintain it through an event that would have burned it out of her like a wire hit by current. It was never built to carry. She survived. She was court-martialed. She was exiled. And she spent years wandering the fringes of the galaxy, a Jedi without a connection to the Force, carrying the weight of Malachor in a silence that most people around her could not understand, because they did not know what had been in that silence before. Then the Force returned. It did not return the way it had left. The connection that slowly re-established itself over the years of her exile was not a restoration of what she had lost. It was something different and strange. Something the Jedi Masters who eventually encountered her in the years after her exile and tried to analyze her case found themselves struggling to find adequate language for. Meetra Surik had been so fundamentally altered by Malachor, by the act of releasing everything she was in that moment, and surviving the other side of it still herself, that she had become a different kind of Force user. Where conventional Jedi connected to the Force individually, drawing power through a personal relationship with that vast living energy, Meetra connected to people. She formed bonds with the individuals in her proximity, genuine and deep Force connections that were not attachments in the philosophical sense the Order worried about, but something more organic than that. Through those bonds, she drew something that functioned like the Force, but operated differently. The Force did not flow through her to the world. It flowed between her and the people around her, and through those connections it amplified itself. What this meant in practice was remarkable and somewhat unsettling to those who observed it carefully. The people near Meetra grew stronger in the Force, not because she was instructing them or deliberately sharing technique. Simply by virtue of her presence, whatever Force sensitivity they possessed seemed to deepen and clarify. Companions who had shown no particular Force ability before began to feel it stirring. Jedi, who had been cut off by the trauma of Malachor, found their connections returning in her vicinity. She was a living echo of the Force, drawing others toward it by a quality of her presence that no one had a satisfactory model for explaining. Kreia, one of the most philosophically sophisticated Force users of the entire Old Republic era, called her a wound in the Force that had learned to breathe. That is a strange description, and also a very precise one. Her combat abilities were considerable and had been sharpened by years of survival in circumstances that no Jedi Academy could replicate. She had endured things that had no training analog, come through encounters that should have ended her, and developed fighting instincts rooted in her unusual Force sensitivity in ways that made her genuinely difficult to anticipate. But it is not her combat record that places her on this list. It is what she ultimately did with the nature that Malachor had given her. When the time came to confront Vitiate, the Sith Emperor whose power was so comprehensive and so dark that he had consumed all life on an entire planet in a single ritual and emerged from it functionally immortal, it was Mitra Surik who crossed the known galaxy to find him. She joined a small group that traveled beyond Republic space into the hidden Sith Empire, one of the most dangerous destinations in the galaxy for a Jedi. When they finally reached Vitiate, it was Mitra who struck the blow that separated him from his captive, that freed Revan from the imprisonment that had held him for years. She was betrayed an instant later by an ally who had calculated that the moment was not yet right for Vitiate to fall. She died for what she had done, but she had already done it. And the manner of her life, from Malachor to that ending, tells you something that goes beyond the simple metrics of Force power. Mitra Surik survived the unsurvivable not by being stronger than what she faced, but by understanding, at the deepest possible level, when to hold and when to release. She carried the consequences of a decision that most beings would have broken beneath and transformed them into a new way of being alive in the Force. That is a kind of power that no midi-chlorian count can measure. Vapad is a word that appears rarely in Jedi records and almost never in public discussion. It is the seventh form of lightsaber combat, the final form, the one the Order spent considerable time and philosophical energy debating whether it should be practiced at all. Every other form, from the precise, elegant Makashi to the aggressive, momentum-based gem, so to the total defensive architecture of Soresu, operates from the same foundational principle. The practitioner draws their power from their own discipline and from the light side of the Force. Vapad operates from a different principle entirely. It works by touching the darkness, not surrendering to it, not opening yourself to it in the way the Sith do, but touching it deliberately, with full conscious awareness of what you are doing, using it as a conduit for a power that incorporates both sides of the Force rather than restricting itself to one. In theory, this is the most powerful combat methodology available to any Force user, because it does not limit itself. It draws from the full spectrum. In practice, it is almost impossible to execute safely, because the history of everyone who tried something similar, without the specific internal constitution it requires, is written in the names of the fallen, Jedi who went looking for power at the edge of the dark side and did not come back from it. Masters who saw the methodology and understood the potential and attempted it and were consumed. The form is not dangerous because it is ineffective. It is dangerous precisely because it is devastatingly effective, and because the price of losing control of it midway through is your soul. Mace Windu not only developed Vapad from its theoretical foundations into a complete combat system, he became its only fully realized master. He was the single practitioner in the Order's entire history who could bring Vapad to its true potential without being destroyed by what that required. One other student, Depa Bilaba, came very close to his level and then shattered under the psychological demands of the form in a way that took years to recover from. Mace held, year after year and duel after duel, because of something in his fundamental character that he himself described as the capacity to channel his own darkness, his frustrations, his anger, his deep and very real aggression, which he never pretended was not there. where most Jedi practiced detachment as their primary strategy for managing the pull of the dark side, which meant keeping at a safe distance from everything in themselves that the dark side might exploit. Mace Windu looked directly at all of it and found a way to run it through the form rather than suppress it. The darkness in him did not feed the dark side. It fed the light through the specific and remarkable alchemy of Vapad. The purple lightsaber crystal was not an affectation or an aesthetic choice. The Jedi used blue crystals, associated with particular aspects of Force connection through the Jedi path, or green, associated with a different but related quality of Force alignment. Mace's blade was purple because the crystal he bonded with reflected something genuine about his nature, a blending of frequencies that corresponded to the coexistence in him of qualities that most practitioners kept in separate categories. He was both aggressive and serene, at the same time, in the same moment, as a unified thing rather than as a contradiction he managed. And he had found a way to make that unified thing more powerful than either component alone could ever have been. In terms of raw combat ability, Mace Windu was, by most serious assessments, the greatest active duelist the Jedi Order contained during the years of the Clone Wars. He himself said so, without apparent embarrassment. And the record of his engagements supported the claim, rather than making it look like arrogance. He was the Jedi that other Jedi thought of when they tried to imagine what the very best looked like. His tactical intelligence matched his physical ability, which is rarer than it might sound. Many great fighters are great precisely because they have learned to stop thinking and start feeling. But combat strategy at the level Mace operated required both the physical perfection and the analytical mind working simultaneously. And he had both. Look at what he did at Geonosis, which was not a planned military engagement but a chaotic arena situation that required someone to organize a meaningful response with no preparation, no established command structure, and a collection of Jedi who had come on a rescue operation rather than a combat deployment. Mace organized that response faster than anyone had a right to expect. Engaged battle droids and separatist combatants across a wide and chaotic field, while simultaneously coordinating the efforts of the other Jedi around him, and came out of it still standing, still functional, still in command. That is not ordinary. That is what exceptional looks like, under conditions specifically designed to prevent exceptional. Through the years of the Clone Wars, he occupied a role that wore down even the most resilient of his contemporaries. Military commander, council member, strategic advisor to a Senate he increasingly suspected of harboring the very darkness he had sworn to oppose. He watched the order he loved being used in ways that violated everything it was supposed to stand for. And he kept going. He was one of the first among the council to articulate clearly and without hedging his suspicion that the dark side had not merely returned to the galaxy, but had already penetrated the highest levels of Republic governance. He was right. He said so long before the proof was available. The confrontation with Darth Sidious is where Mace Windu's story is most often discussed and most frequently misread. He fought the most powerful Sith Lord in 1,000 years, a being who had hidden his dark side nature from the collective Force sensitivity of an entire order of trained practitioners for decades, who had manipulated galactic history with a precision and patience that belonged to a different category of intelligence than most beings could access. He fought him, and he was winning. He disarmed him. He had Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord who would become Emperor Palpatine, beaten on the floor of his own office. The story is usually told as a tragedy because Anakin's intervention changed the outcome. But what actually happened in that room before the intervention that changed it was one of the most remarkable things a Jedi ever did. There is an analysis that persists among those who have studied the duel carefully, grounded in the specific mechanics of what Varpad does. Varpad, at its highest level, takes an opponent's own aggression and dark side energy and uses it against them, reflects it back in amplified form, turns their ferocity into fuel for your own blade. Against a practitioner of Varpad operating at Mace's level, the more Sidious attacked, the more dangerous those attacks became for Sidious himself. The shift to Force lightning may not have been a natural escalation. It may have been the only path still available to a being who could feel what was happening to every attack he threw, and understood that the lightsaber confrontation was moving in only one direction. Mace Windu may have forced the most powerful Sith Lord in a millennium to abandon his primary fighting strategy because it was not working. If that reading is correct, then what happened on that floor before Anakin walked through the door was this: a Jedi so powerful and so precise in his unique form that he backed Darth Sidious into a corner. He did not win the larger story. But in that room, in that moment, before fate intervened in the form of a young man whose love had become desperation, Mace Windu did something almost no one in the history of the Order had ever done. He made Darth Sidious afraid. The next name on this list requires us to go much further back past the Clone Wars and the High Republic and the Mandalorian conflicts, and even the years of the Old Republic, as most students of history mark its span, back to the Great Sith War, a period of conflict so total and so devastating that the galaxy the Order inhabited after it was meaningfully different from the galaxy that had existed before. A period when Sith were not a secret organization of two, not a patient conspiracy working in shadow, but an open and enormous presence in the galaxy, and the wars they brought were eruptions of dark side power that left systems ruined and cost the Jedi Order. Lives at a scale that would have been unimaginable to the later practitioners sitting in the temple on Coruscant. Nomi Sunrider did not come from that world through formal preparation. She did not grow up in the temple. She was not identified as an infant and delivered to the Order for the kind of structured development that later Jedi took as the default path. She was a wife and a companion to a Jedi Knight named Andor Sunrider, traveling with him and their young daughter toward a new master, carrying a Force sensitivity that had never been formally trained and that she herself had not yet understood as something requiring attention. She had no combat experience. She had no lightsaber instruction. She had a child and a husband and a journey that was supposed to lead somewhere safer and better than where she had been. Andor was killed before they reached their destination, ambushed by criminals who wanted what he was carrying, cut down in front of his wife and his daughter, without the kind of dramatic warning that stories usually provide to give the people involved time to prepare. And Nomi, standing in the aftermath of that, with her child still in danger and the threat still present, and everything she had been relying on suddenly gone, picked up her husband's lightsaber. She had never held one before. She had no training. She moved on something that bypassed knowledge and technique entirely, some deep current of the Force that ran through her in the moment of absolute necessity and let her do what the situation required without any of the preparation the situation should have demanded. She survived. She found her way to a master. she began to train. And what developed out of that beginning? Shaped by loss and urgency and a connection to the Force that carried none of the formal limitations that early training sometimes imposes, became one of the most remarkable careers the Old Republic era ever recorded. Her lightsaber technique developed into genuine skill through dedicated effort under difficult conditions, and she became capable enough in direct combat to hold her own in the worst of what the Great Sith War would eventually bring. But this was not her primary expression of Force power, and she knew it early, and her masters knew it early, and both understood that the lightsaber was a foundation rather than a ceiling for her. What she actually was, what she had been from the moment the Force first moved through her at the crisis on that road, was something larger. She could draw on the Force and project it outward with a comprehensiveness that affected not just the immediate space around her, but the living world at a far greater range. Her perception of the Force was not bounded by the normal limits of Jedi sensitivity. It was more like the Force perceived the world through her than the other way around. And what came through was not a trickle, but a current. The masters who observed her development in those early years reached repeatedly for language that the Order's existing vocabulary could not quite provide, because she did not fit the standard models of Force expression. She was not a telekinetic of extraordinary power, though her telekinetic abilities were considerable. She was not primarily a battle combatant of exceptional skill, though she was capable. What she was a conduit of remarkable breadth, a practitioner through whom the Force moved with unusual freedom and unusual scale, and what she could do with that over the course of a career defined by some of the most intense conflict the Jedi had ever faced would eventually be acknowledged as among the most significant Force abilities in the Order's recorded history. Force Light was her signature technique, and in the era of the Great Sith War, it would be needed more desperately than anything the Order had called upon in living memory. The war that Exar Kun and Ulic Kel Droma brought to the galaxy in those years was not like the Sith Wars that came later. It did not work through political subversion or patient infiltration or the long, slow undermining of institutions. It came as something closer to a force of nature, fueled by a Sith power source of almost incomprehensible scale and by the genuine brilliance and genuine darkness of the men who wielded it. Systems burned. Ancient Jedi strongholds fell to attacks that came with a ferocity the Order had not faced in generations. The Jedi bled in ways that living masters had no framework for, because nothing in their experience had prepared them for this scale of loss. The Great Sith War consumed resources and lives, and, perhaps most damagingly, the Order's sense of its own durability. The assumption that the Jedi would endure, that the light side would prevail because it always had, came under direct and violent challenge from people who were not random dark side fanatics, but former Jedi who understood exactly what they were fighting and how to fight it. The Jedi Council, facing a threat that exceeded anything they had prepared contingencies for, turned toward the practitioners with the broadest and deepest Force connections the Order currently contained. The decision of where to position Nomi Sunrider in that conflict, what role to assign to her particular quality of power, was not a difficult one to make. They put her where she could do the most damage to the darkness, which meant in the most critical confrontations the war produced. What she did in the final engagement of the Great Sith War on the moon of Yavin 4, where Exar Kun had made his stronghold among the ancient Massassi temples, and where he had gathered his remaining followers for a last, desperate ritual, designed to escape the military defeat that had become inevitable, established her place in Jedi history beyond any reasonable argument. Kun's ritual was not a simple dark side technique. It was a sacrifice of enormous scale, designed to separate his spirit from his physical body and preserve his consciousness in the Force itself, in the dark side energy that saturated the temples of Yavin 4, where he could remain hidden and intact and eventually return. It was a plan built around his understanding that even a total military defeat did not have to mean total destruction, that the Force was a space vast enough to hide in if you knew how to disappear into it. Nomi Sunrider and the Jedi assembled at Yavin 4 did not let him disappear. Working in concert with a gathered force of Jedi whose combined light side power she helped coordinate and sustain at a level that exceeded what any of them could have maintained individually, Nomi helped create what Jedi records call the Wall of Light. A projection of Force light so concentrated and so comprehensively sustained that it did not merely push back the dark side energy Kun had poured into the ritual. It contained him. It held his spirit within the stone of the Massassi temple walls, trapped in a location rather than freed into the vast anonymity of the Force the way his ritual had intended. Not destroyed, contained, held, denied the escape that should have been his for the taking. The power required to accomplish that, to impose the will of the light side upon a dark side presence of that magnitude and hold it fixed against everything it was doing to resist, is not something that can be measured in the ordinary vocabulary of Force ability. It belongs to a different category. It is Force power operating at the level of the permanent, changing what is possible in a location in a way that does not fade when the practitioner stops concentrating. Exar Kun's spirit remained trapped in those Massassi temples for thousands of years. When Jedi students discovered his presence there thousands of years later, still intact, still dangerous, still exactly where Nomi Sunrider and those Jedi had placed him, that was a measure of what she had done. The containment held across millennia because it had been made correctly at the right scale by someone with the Force connection broad enough to sustain it. She later became Grand Master of the Jedi Order, the highest position the institution could offer. The recognition was accurate, and, by the measure of her career, something close to inevitable. But the title matters less than what the career behind it had demonstrated. She was a woman who found the Force by accident in a moment of devastating loss, who had no path laid out for her and no training prepared in advance, who built herself into one of the most powerful Jedi practitioners her era, produced through the combination of raw connection and hard-earned experience that no academy curriculum had managed to replicate, and who, when the moment came that required everything she had, gave it without hesitation and did not fall short. That is where part 1 of this list leaves us, with 5 extraordinary Jedi whose power has been measured against the worst the galaxy could produce and found sufficient. In some cases, found more than sufficient, found capable of things that changed what everyone after them understood the Force to be. But we have only begun to climb this particular mountain. The names still ahead of us are not simply greater versions of what we have already seen. They represent different categories of Force connection, different scales of what one person can accomplish through the Force when the conditions of their life and the depth of their commitment come together in ways that produce something genuinely unprecedented. The story continues, and it gets considerably more remarkable from here. Every list like this one contains a name that does not belong the way the others belong. not because the person is undeserving, but because they stand slightly outside the clean moral architecture of the Jedi tradition and force you to decide whether power alone is sufficient qualification or whether power needs to be anchored in something else before it counts. Exar Kun is that name on this list. He was trained as a Jedi. He achieved things as a Force user that no Jedi had managed before him, and very few would manage after. The scale of what he could do, the depth of his dark side connection, the sheer breadth of ancient Sith knowledge he mastered in a career that was cut violently short by the combined effort of the most powerful Jedi Force the galaxy had assembled in generations, places him objectively in the conversation about the most powerful Force users who ever lived. And he belongs on this list specifically because understanding what he became helps clarify the nature of the gifts the Jedi Order lost when he walked away from it. The Force did not diminish when Exar Kun fell, but the Jedi lost access to someone whose potential, properly oriented, might have been extraordinary in ways they never got to see. He came into the Order talented beyond what the standard measurements of talent were designed to capture. His masters recognized this immediately, and with the particular mixture of excitement and unease that always accompanied students who were going to be either exceptional or dangerous. He was curious in ways that the Order's curriculum could not fully satisfy, driven by an appetite for knowledge that kept pushing past the boundaries of what his instructors were prepared to teach. They were not wrong to be cautious about this. History was full of Jedi who had followed that particular appetite into places that consumed them. The Order had learned, painfully and at significant cost, that the desire to know everything is not the same as the wisdom to handle everything that knowing reveals. The Sith texts called to him specifically, not just as academic objects, not just as historical artifacts to be studied behind the proper institutional safeguards, but as living sources of knowledge that were actively reaching toward anyone sensitive enough to hear them. The archives on Ossus held materials that had been locked away precisely because they had a quality of influence that proper scholars had recognized as incompatible with maintaining a stable Jedi orientation. Exar Kun heard them. And rather than treating that hearing as a warning signal, the way his training was supposed to have taught him to, he treated it as an invitation. His descent was not a simple thing and should not be remembered as one, because the way he fell tells you something important about the nature of the dark side that remains relevant long after his story ends. He did not fall in anger. He did not fall in grief. He fell in curiosity, which is the most insidious version of the fall because the person experiencing it can tell themselves for a very long time that they are still in control, that they are studying rather than being consumed, that they understand what they are touching and have not yet been touched by it in return. Exar Kun told himself this across the journey that took him from Ossus to Korriban to the Massassi temples of Yavin 4. And somewhere along that journey, the story he was telling himself stopped being accurate. By the time he arrived at Yavin 4 and made the choice that removed the last of his Jedi identity, the curiosity had become something else. The dark side had found the shape of him and moved in. What he built on Yavin 4 deserves serious attention because it was not the construction of a simple warlord or a power-hungry tyrant. Exar Kun was a builder of institutions. He enslaved the Massassi people and used their labor, but he also used their bodies and their connection to the Force in alchemical experiments of a scale and sophistication that surpassed almost anything the Sith had attempted since the height of the ancient Sith Empire. He created creatures. He designed weapons. He mastered techniques from Sith texts that had been sealed away for centuries precisely because no one had been confident that a living practitioner could handle them safely, and he handled them not always safely for the beings around him, but always under his control. His lightsaber form shifted from the Ataru-influenced style of his Jedi years into something darker and more comprehensive, incorporating combat techniques drawn from Sith traditions that had not been practiced in the galaxy's living memory. The war he launched with Ulic Qel-Droma was the most coordinated and devastating Sith assault on the Republic in centuries. He did not simply attack militarily. He attacked the Jedi Order at its foundations, walking into the temple on Coruscant with a confidence that should have been impossible, and using his Force presence and his dark charisma to turn Padawans against their masters in a wave of betrayals that cut the Order's strength at exactly the wrong moment. The manipulation required to accomplish that, to step into the most protected Jedi institution in the galaxy and leave it structurally damaged without anyone being able to stop you, speaks to a level of Force power and Force presence that goes beyond combat ability into something considerably more disturbing. He was not just strong, he was persuasive at the level that the Force makes possible for someone fully committed to the dark side, someone through whom the dark side's most seductive qualities flowed unimpeded by any remaining attachment to the light. His ritual at the end, when the Republic fleet was closing and the military defeat was inevitable, was the clearest demonstration of his actual scale as a Force user. He gathered the Massassi, thousands of them, and he pulled their life force through the Force and into himself in a sustained dark side, working of a complexity and a power that most dark side practitioners could not have attempted and survived. The intent was to separate his spirit from his physical body and preserve his consciousness in the dark side energy saturating Yavin 4's ancient temples, escaping death by becoming something that was not quite alive in the conventional sense, but was also definitively not gone. He succeeded, partially, as we have already discussed, because Nomi Sunrider and the assembled Jedi did not allow him to complete the transition into the freedom he had designed the ritual to achieve. But the fact that the ritual worked at all, that his spirit survived the destruction of his body and remained coherent and intact and powerful within those temple walls for thousands of years afterward, tells you something definitive about the depth of his Force connection. He was not the most powerful Jedi who ever lived. He was not a Jedi at all by the end. But as a demonstration of raw Force capacity operating through someone who had begun in the Jedi tradition, his story sits in a category that cannot be ignored. The name that comes next sits at the absolute center of this list, and not by accident. Every name we have discussed so far, and every name that follows, in some way circles the figure of Revan. His story touches the history of the Mandalorian Wars, the Jedi Civil War, the hidden Sith Empire, the foundational philosophy that would shape the Sith for 1,000 years after his death, and the family line that would eventually produce some of the most significant Force users in the late Republic era. To call him complicated is not quite accurate. Complicated implies that there are specific points of contradiction in a person that you can identify and analyze one by one. Revan was not complicated in that way. He was comprehensive. He was someone through whom the Force moved in ways that did not restrict themselves to either side of the distinction the tradition had built its entire philosophy around. And what he did with that comprehensiveness reshaped the galaxy in ways that are still being felt thousands of years later. His early training in the Jedi Temple was notable for a quality his masters kept reaching for language to describe: an appetite for knowledge. Yes, the same one his teachers noticed and worried about in the way they worried about all students who wanted more than the curriculum offered. But beneath the appetite was something more specific, a particular sensitivity to force connections in all their varieties. Most Jedi learned about force bonds, the deep connections that could form between practitioners, as a category of experience to be cautious about, something that could create attachments, and attachments led away from the light. Revan studied them as a practitioner studies a technique. He wanted to understand the mechanics. He wanted to know how they actually worked, what they meant about the nature of the Force, what possibilities they opened up that ordinary individual connection to the Force could not access. This was not academic curiosity in the detached sense. He was learning because he intended to use what he learned. And he had the Force sensitivity to turn whatever he understood into something practical at a pace that repeatedly surprised his instructors. The Mandalorian Wars called to him the same way they called to thousands of other Jedi of his generation, through a moral argument that the Order's leadership refused to hear. The Mandalorians were killing people. The Republic was struggling. The Jedi Council, operating from a perspective that would be vindicated by history in some ways and indicted by it in others, declared that the conflict was not what it appeared to be and that the Order should not intervene. Revan looked at what was happening and made a different calculation. He was not wrong about the immediate facts. People were dying who did not have to die if the Jedi acted. Where he went wrong was in the consequences of acting, which is a distinction that the Force itself seemed to be trying to communicate to him through the particular shape the war took and the particular damage it did to everyone who survived it. He was a military commander of genuine and transformative genius. This is not a casual compliment. The history of the Mandalorian Wars, examined without the distortion of mythologizing or condemnation, reveals a strategic mind operating at the level where individual engagements become pieces in a larger pattern that only the person conducting the campaign can fully see. He did not win by being stronger than the Mandalorians in the Force. He won by understanding the structure of the conflict at a level the Mandalorian commanders could not match, and by being willing to make decisions about acceptable loss and acceptable cost that more constrained commanders would have refused to make. The Battle of Malachor V was the final and most devastating expression of that willingness. He did not activate the mass shadow generator himself, but the strategic architecture that made it possible. The decision to gather the Mandalorian fleet at that location and the foreknowledge of what the weapon would do to everything present, the coordination required to get all those pieces in alignment at the right moment, that was his. He built that. What the Emperor of the Hidden Sith Empire did to him afterward says more about Revan's strength than his capture might initially suggest. Vitiate, who had consumed an entire planet's life force in a single ritual and transformed himself into something that persisted beyond ordinary definitions of death, who had ruled a hidden empire for centuries through a combination of force power and absolute terror, who was by any reasonable assessment the most powerful single force user the galaxy had ever produced, took Revan and his companion Malak, both at the height of their abilities following the Mandalorian Wars, and broke them. He dominated them. He overrode their minds and their will and their identities, and replaced those with purpose shaped to his own ends. And then he sent them out into the galaxy to do his work. They accepted the mission without question. What happened next is the part the records struggle to explain adequately. The Star Forge's dark side energy should have completed their corruption. It was specifically designed to amplify the dark side in anyone who used it, drawing them deeper into its influence and away from anything that might counterbalance what it was feeding them. Instead, something in Revan, some quality of will or force connection or fundamental nature that Vitiate's domination had suppressed, rather than destroyed, began to resurface in the Starforge's environment. He broke free. Not easily, and not without cost, and not into the person he had been before, but he broke free. He regained independent consciousness and independent will while still operating in the full grip of one of the most comprehensive dark side environments the galaxy had ever produced. That is a statement about the quality of his inner constitution that almost nothing else in the historical record can match. His time as Darth Revan, as the Dark Lord of the Sith, who nearly conquered the Republic with the military genius he had refined against the Mandalorians, was a period of genuine darkness. The war he brought was devastating. The Jedi he turned against the Order were devastating. The political and military damage he inflicted on a Republic still recovering from the Mandalorian Wars was devastating. But even in this period, even operating under the dark side's full influence, something in him remained oriented toward a larger purpose. Historians who have examined his decisions carefully have noticed that the empire he was building was not designed purely for destruction. The Republic he was building it to eventually replace was not going to be a ruin. He was trying to forge something capable of withstanding the threat he had felt coming from the outer reaches of the known galaxy, the threat that Vitiate represented, the threat that had started the whole chain of events when he and Malak had crossed into Sith space and been destroyed and reconstructed by a being whose power made everything they thought they knew about Force strength look like an opening paragraph. His redemption through Bastila Shan's intervention, through the Council's decision to give him a new identity and let him find his own way back to the light through lived experience rather than coerced compliance, produced someone that the standard Jedi framework had never had to account for. A person who had been fully trained as a Jedi had fallen completely to the dark side, had mastered Sith knowledge and Sith techniques at the highest levels available, and had then returned to the light without any of that additional knowledge being removed from him. He carried both, not as a tension or a compromise or a carefully managed internal conflict, but as a comprehensiveness. His understanding of the Force, after all of this, was wider than anything the standard Jedi path produced, because the standard Jedi path specifically excluded the half of it that Revan had traveled through and survived. The Jedi Council, when he presented his new philosophical understanding of the Force, after his redemption, rejected it. They could not incorporate what he was telling them into their existing framework. And rather than expanding the framework, they declined the understanding. He accepted this with a patience that, given everything, was remarkable. He had earned the right to be angry about it. He chose not to be. His imprisonment by Vitiate, the 3 centuries he spent in a stasis chamber, being slowly fed upon by the most powerful Sith Lord in history, while his extraordinary will resisted and refused to be broken even across that impossible span of time, is perhaps the most profound statement of what Revan fundamentally was. Vitiate, who had taken his mind in seconds at their first meeting and rewritten it completely, could not do it again under controlled conditions across 300 years of sustained effort. The will that powered the most tactically brilliant military mind of his era, that had broken free of Starforge corruption, that had carried him through everything his extraordinary life had demanded, held, not forever. He was eventually freed by outside intervention rather than his own escape, but it held long enough. And the fact that it held at all against an opponent of that magnitude is a statement about Revan that belongs at the center of any serious conversation about force power in the historical record. He was not the most powerful Jedi in history. He was something more interesting and more difficult to categorize than that. He was the most complete Force user the galaxy produced in the Old Republic era. The person through whom the widest possible range of what the Force could do moved in practical rather than theoretical terms. And the philosophy he arrived at, through his experience, that love and positive attachment could strengthen a Force connection rather than compromise it, that the full spectrum of the Force was richer and more powerful than either pole alone, became a thread that would eventually find its way into the thinking of practitioners who came much later and who never knew his name, the Chosen One. The phrase appears in prophecy. It appears in the records of the Jedi Council deliberations, in the arguments of masters who believed it, and masters who thought it was a dangerous piece of mythology being mistaken for instruction. It appears in the way certain individuals spoke about a boy from Tatooine who had no father and a midi-chlorian count that stopped every medical scanner that tried to read it, because the number it produced was not a number that the scanner's designers had expected to need to account for. The highest ever recorded, by a margin that was not incremental. Anakin Skywalker was not simply a powerful Force user. He was something the Jedi Order's entire history of identifying and measuring Force sensitivity had not prepared them to receive. The theoretical framework they used to think about what a Force-sensitive being could potentially become was built around the most exceptional practitioners they had ever encountered, calibrated against the peak of what the tradition had produced. Anakin broke that calibration on the day Qui-Gon Jinn brought him to Coruscant. The numbers the Council ran on him when they conducted their own assessment were the same numbers Qui-Gon had seen on Tatooine. They were real. They were not an artifact of a malfunctioning instrument or an anomalous reading that a second test would normalize. They were what he was. And what he was, in the raw language of Force sensitivity before any training had shaped or focused or refined it, was something that had no precedent in the Order's entire recorded history. His raw power expressed itself early and without the kind of conscious control that formal training develops, the mechanical sensitivity that let him read and respond to systems faster than his conscious mind should have been able to process, the reflexes that made his pod racing career on Tatooine something Jedi Masters watched recordings of and went quiet afterward. The way objects in his vicinity sometimes moved without his intention, all of this was the Force operating through someone whose channel for it was so wide that it could not stay fully contained even in a child who had received no instruction in how to use it. The midi-chlorians do not create Force power, they mediate it. They are the interface between the living body and the Force that flows through all things. A very high count does not mean a very strong person. It means a very open interface, a very wide channel, a connection to the Force that operates with a degree of freedom and directness that most beings never experience at any point in their lives, regardless of training. Anakin's channel was the widest ever recorded. What came through it when he learned to direct it was proportional to that width. His progression through the Clone Wars as a military commander, as a Jedi Knight, and as a Force practitioner ran along a trajectory that his own masters found difficult to track, because it moved faster than the standard models for Jedi development predicted it should. He was not simply learning techniques and adding them to a repertoire. He was integrating them, building a Force relationship that was less about specific skills and more about an increasingly comprehensive attunement to the living Force in real time. The living Force was what Qui-Gon had been most sensitive to, and there was a quality in Anakin's connection to it that carried echoes of his late master's approach, a kind of immediacy and presence focus that sat alongside the formal Jedi training he was receiving and sometimes ran ahead of it. In combat, this translated into something that opponents with more training and more years of experience found genuinely disorienting. He did not fight the way trained Jedi fought. He fought the way the Force moved through him, which was not always the same thing and was usually more effective in the immediate moment than anything a textbook could have produced. His fall is the most analyzed event in the history of the Order, for reasons that go beyond tragedy. It is analyzed because it raises a question that nobody fully answered in his lifetime, and that the later tradition only partially resolved. The question is this: if the Force itself generated him, if the midi-chlorians produced him without a father, as what the ancient prophecy described as the Chosen One, if his raw capacity for Force connection exceeded everything the Order had ever measured, then what does it mean that the dark side could claim him? Not through simple temptation or through some exceptional dark side power overwhelming his defenses, but through his own love and his own fear and his own unwillingness to accept that the people he loved existed in the Force's hands and not exclusively in his. The dark side found the crack in his formation, which was the part that was most human and most alive, and it moved through that crack into everything. What he became as Darth Vader was not a diminishment of his Force power. In some respects, the dark side amplified the raw capacity he had always carried, fueling it with an intensity and a controlled ferocity that his Jedi years had worked to moderate. The armor reduced his physical capability in certain ways, limited the acrobatic combat forms he had been most naturally aligned with, constrained what his body could do in ways that genuinely affected his lightsaber work. But the Force connection itself continued to operate at the scale it had always operated. Darth Vader was one of the most dangerous Force presences the galaxy had ever produced, and the practitioners who encountered him and survived to discuss the experience consistently described it in the same terms. He did not feel like an ordinary dark side user. He felt like something older and larger than that. The dark side flowed through him with a current that belonged to a different category than what they had encountered in other practitioners. His return, at the very end of everything, on the second Death Star above Endor, was the thing the prophecy had always been pointing toward. He destroyed Darth Sidious. He broke the Sith's grip on the galaxy at the cost of himself. But the how matters enormously. He did not destroy Sidious through Force power. He destroyed him through choice, through love for his son overcoming, finally and completely, everything the dark side had built in him over the 23 years since Mustafar. The Force lightning that was killing Luke was the trigger that reached past Vader and found Anakin Skywalker still present inside all of that darkness, still capable of being reached by love, still capable of choosing. He chose, and in choosing, he fulfilled the thing the Force had made him to fulfill. The Force did not make the Chosen One to be the greatest lightsaber duelist in history. It did not make him to accumulate the most power or demonstrate the most impressive technique or build the largest institution or survive the longest. It made him to restore balance at the moment when balance had been most profoundly broken. And what that required was not power in any conventional sense. It required the willingness, at the right moment, to choose the right thing regardless of the cost. The cost was everything. He paid it without hesitation. He appeared afterward as a Force ghost, which tells you the same thing it tells you every time a Jedi manages it. The Force connection was deep enough and complete enough to survive the dissolution of the physical body. The Chosen One, who had spent over 2 decades as the instrument of the dark side's galactic dominance, was present in the Force, at peace, exactly where he needed to be. He was not the greatest Jedi in history by the measure of technique or raw power, though the raw power was greater than anyone else had ever carried. He was something more specific than that. He was the reason there was still a galaxy for the Jedi to serve when the story finally reached the place it had been moving toward all along. Now we arrive at the names that exist in their own tier, separated from everything else we have discussed, not by degree but by kind. And the first of these belongs to a being who was training Padawans before any other Jedi currently alive had been born, who had watched the galaxy change and change again across 9 centuries of continuous presence, who had accumulated a depth of Force, understanding that no amount of talent in a shorter lifetime could replicate, and who, even at the end of that extraordinary span, was still being surprised by what the Force had left to show him. Yoda's species is one of the great unresolved mysteries of the galaxy's biological catalogue. No name for them appears in any public archive. No home world is recorded in any document that has been made available to general researchers. What is known is that the species lives far longer than almost any other sentient species in the known galaxy, that they develop slowly by the standards of most beings, and that their connection to the Force, in the individuals of the species who possess Force sensitivity, tends toward a quality that the human Jedi who trained alongside Yoda's students consistently described as being in the presence of something very old and very settled in a way that most Force users, however accomplished, simply were not. Yoda entered the Jedi Order as a youngling approximately 860 years before the Battle of Yavin. He was trained for the standard Jedi formation period, then knighted, then took Padawans of his own, then continued to grow in the Force at the pace that his species' long lifespan made possible, accumulating over the centuries a depth of connection and a breadth of understanding that had no precedent and no parallel in the Order's history. He did not become Grand Master because he outlasted everyone else. He became Grand Master because 900 years of uninterrupted practice and reflection and engagement with the Force had produced someone whose understanding of it operated on a different level than what any practitioner with a more conventionally lengthed career could achieve. The gap between a Jedi with 40 years of experience and one with 400 is not simply a matter of knowing more techniques. It is a matter of having had the time to encounter every scenario the Force presents, every temptation, every challenge, every form of loss, and every form of renewal, often enough that the responses are no longer learned reactions, but deeply embedded qualities of character. The Force does not just teach through instruction. It teaches through lived experience, accumulated across sufficient time. Yoda had 9 centuries of that living. What he had developed by the time of the Clone Wars was not simply power in the conventional sense of what a Force user could do in a specific situation. It was a quality of presence, a depth of attunement to the Force's movement, and the Force's will that practitioners far stronger in raw terms could feel when they were near him and could not quite account for. His combat ability at physical peak was genuine and considerable. The speed and acrobatic force amplification his species' smaller body was capable of, combined with his mastery of Ataru and his complete integration of the Force into every movement, made him one of the most dangerous duelists the Order had produced in his era. This is not the most important thing about him, but it needs to be said clearly because the mythology around his physical fighting style sometimes overshadows the more significant reality of his Force connection. His combat ability at physical peak was genuine and considerable. The speed and acrobatic force amplification his species' smaller body was capable of, combined with his mastery of Ataru and his complete integration of the Force into every movement, made him one of the most dangerous duelists the Order had produced in his era. This is not the most important thing about him, but it needs to be said clearly because the mythology around his physical fighting style sometimes overshadows the more significant reality of his Force connection. There is a quality that practitioners who observed Yoda in the council chamber over the years described consistently and with an honesty that suggests they were not romanticizing, but accurately reporting something real. Being in Yoda's presence when he was fully engaged with the Force felt different from being in any other senior master's presence. Not more intense in the way that very powerful Force users could feel intense, like standing near a bright fire that radiated heat outward. More like standing in a place where the Force itself had been moving for a very long time, where the accumulation of practice and presence had left something in the air of whatever room he occupied, a quality of depth and stillness that practitioners with sensitivity could feel as a physical fact. He had been practicing for so long and with such complete commitment that the Force had, in some sense, that the Order's vocabulary did not quite have adequate language for, shaped itself around him. He was not just connected to the Force. He was, after 9 centuries, a place where the Force had chosen to be particularly present. The Clone Wars, which represented the most sustained and devastating challenge to the Order's integrity and living memory, revealed something about Yoda that the long peace of the preceding centuries had not had occasion to demonstrate fully. His response to the moral complexity of the conflict, to the gradual and then accelerating corruption of the Republic that the Order was helping to defend, to the growing certainty that the dark side had already penetrated the highest levels of governance, and that the Jedi were being used as instruments of their own destruction, was not denial or suppression, or the kind of institutional loyalty that mistakes the organization for the principles it was built to embody. He felt all of it. His sensitivity to the Force's condition was precise enough that the growing darkness registered on him with a directness that was physically present in how he carried himself through those years. He grieved it clearly, and without the kind of distance that would have made the grief more manageable. He chose that. The willingness to feel the full weight of what was happening, rather than managing it into something smaller and more comfortable, was a decision that his 9 centuries of practice had taught him to make. Real wisdom is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of feeling in a person who has learned how to carry it without being deformed by it. He carried Anakin's fall as a personal failure of his own. This deserves acknowledgement because it would have been easier, and some might have argued more accurate, to assign the primary responsibility for what happened to Palpatine's manipulation, which was extraordinary, or to the Council's institutional blindness, which was real, or to Anakin's own choices, which were freely made. Yoda did not deflect in any of these directions. He said directly, in the cave on Dagobah, before his death, that he had failed. That the failure of an entire order in its most critical moment was also his failure as the senior figure in that order. As the master who had advised and counseled and shaped policy for centuries, he carried that. He did not put it down. And still he retained enough clarity and enough hope and enough trust in the Force to send Luke Skywalker to face his father rather than destroy him. Because the Force was showing him something about what the relationship between that father and that son was capable of becoming. And he trusted what he saw. That trust, offered in the context of everything he had already lost and everything the dark side had already done to the people and the institutions he had devoted his entire long life to, is the most remarkable thing Yoda ever did. Not the acrobatics, not the 9 centuries of accumulated mastery, the willingness, at the very end of everything, to trust again. What mattered most about Yoda was the breadth of what he understood. He could not be caught by surprise at the emotional or philosophical level because he had lived through every version of what the Force asked of its servants. He had watched Padawans become knights, become masters, become casualties of wars he had counseled against. He had watched political systems. He had served decay from within and collapse into the darkness they had always had the capacity to become. He had lost students. He had lost colleagues. He had lost. In the final horror of Order 66, the greater part of an institution he had built his entire life. Inside, watching it destroyed in a single coordinated moment by enemies who had hidden inside his trust for decades. He had carried all of this across centuries of a life that had been defined by service and loss in proportions that would have unmade any being with a weaker center. And he remained, not unchanged, not without grief, but remained, which is itself a form of strength that the shorter lives around him could not fully appreciate because they had not been tested across the same span. His decision to accept exile on Dagobah rather than fight Darth Sidious to the death after their duel in the Senate chamber is always analyzed and frequently misread. The frame that describes it as defeat misses something essential. Yoda had 9 centuries of experience reading the Force's movement and following it rather than his own preferences about how situations should resolve. In that moment, on that Senate floor, having dueled the most powerful Sith practitioner in 1,000 years to something approaching a standstill before the terrain and circumstances ended, the engagement without a clean resolution, the Force was telling him something clear. Not this way. Not now. This was not the moment. There was another path, and another instrument, and another time. And his role was to survive long enough to preserve what could be preserved and to prepare what needed to be prepared for the confrontation the Force had already arranged in the future. He felt this, not as a comfortable rationalization for retreat, but as the Force's actual instruction, delivered to someone who had spent 900 years learning how to listen to it clearly enough that he could tell the difference between its guidance and his own preferences. He followed it. He went to Dagobah. He waited. He trained Luke Skywalker when the moment arrived. And the outcome of the larger story, the thing the Force had been arranging across all those centuries, was exactly what it needed to be. He learned immortality from Qui-Gon Jinn. That is worth pausing on. The most senior Jedi alive, the Grand Master of an order that had been practicing for over 25,000 years, received his deepest understanding of what the Force could do with consciousness from a practitioner who had never been given a seat on the council. Yoda was honest enough about his own limitations, after 9 centuries of being confronted with them, to receive that teaching without ego and without the kind of institutional resistance that would have prevented a being less genuinely committed to the Force's actual nature from hearing it. He became a Force ghost after his death. He remained coherent and communicating, and capable of genuine guidance for decades afterward, appearing to Luke when Luke needed him in ways that shaped the new Jedi Order's understanding of what it was supposed to be. He was not the most powerful in terms of raw Force capacity. The midi-chlorian comparison would not have favored him against the highest counts in the tradition. But wisdom that has been built across 9 centuries of daily practice and continuous refinement is its own form of power, and it is a form that raw capacity cannot simply override or replace. It sits in a different category, and it belongs near the top of any serious list of what Force mastery has looked like across the full span of galactic history. Now we reach the end. And the end of this list is not where most people expect it to be, because the name at the very top is someone whose era is recent enough that his story is still frequently being discussed in the present tense, and the scale of what he accomplished is sometimes obscured by familiarity. People know Luke Skywalker. They know the twin sons of Tatooine. They know the trench run and the cave on Dagobah, and the moment he dropped his lightsaber in front of the Emperor and refused. These images are so embedded in the galaxy's cultural memory that it becomes difficult to see through them to the actual historical record, which, when examined without the romanticism, describes something genuinely extraordinary. The legend's account of Luke Skywalker does not describe the hero of the original trilogy. It describes what that person became over the 4 decades after Return of the Jedi. And what he became is something the galaxy had arguably never seen before. Start with what he came from. His father was the Chosen One, the being with the highest midi-chlorian count ever recorded, generated by the Force itself without biological paternity, the instrument of a prophecy thousands of years old. His mother was a woman of such extraordinary political intelligence and personal strength that she continued to shape galactic events even after her death, her legacy outlasting her body by generations. His twin sister was herself one of the most powerful Force-sensitive beings of their era, someone who might have become one of the great Jedi of the New Republic period, had the circumstances of her life allowed the kind of focused training her ability deserved. Luke inherited from this family line a Force connection that began at a level other practitioners spent lifetimes working to approach, and then spent 40 years of the most intense and unusual Jedi education the tradition had ever produced building on top of it. His formal training was fragmented in ways that should have been limiting. A ghost, an ancient exile on a swamp planet, who died before he had finished teaching him everything he intended to teach. Ancient texts that the Old Order had preserved, and that Luke found and studied in ways the Order's formal curriculum would never have arranged. He filled in the gaps himself, through combat, through experience, through a willingness to go into the dark places of the Force and come out of them, not because he was unafraid, but because the mission required it. And he refused to let fear make the decision. The cave on Dagobah, the Emperor's throne room, Wayland, where he felt the dark side pressing against the edges of his control during his confrontation with Kabauth, the well of the dark side. Every one of these was a place where a practitioner, without extraordinary internal constitution, would have been claimed by what they encountered. Luke walked through all of them, not unscathed, not unchanged, but through. He rebuilt the Jedi Order from nothing. This deserves more weight than it usually receives in discussions of his power, because the act of reconstruction is not simply an institutional or administrative achievement. It required him to make philosophical choices about the nature of the Force and the nature of the Jedi path that the old Order's centuries of accumulated doctrine had already made for the Order that preceded him. He could not simply restore what had been, because what had been contained within it, the very rigidities and blindnesses that had allowed the Sith to operate undetected inside its structures for decades. He had to build something that preserved the genuine wisdom of the tradition while releasing what had been calcified and harmful. He had to do this while simultaneously fighting the remnants of the Empire, facing threats that the old Order had never encountered, losing students and colleagues in new conflicts, and continuing to develop as a Force practitioner himself throughout all of it. The scale of what he could do in combat at his peak was genuinely without precedent in the living tradition. Telekinesis at a range and precision and power level that other Force users observed and found difficult to comprehend as belonging to a mortal practitioner. Force speed that permitted movement so rapid, it exceeded the processing capability of most opponents' visual systems. The ability to perceive the Force's movement in real time, at a breadth that allowed him to respond to threats in his immediate vicinity and beyond it simultaneously. His lightsaber work, which had begun with no formal training and a ghost teacher and a brief period of instruction on Dagobah, had developed through decades of the most extreme practical testing the galaxy could produce into something that Jedi Masters who trained under him found it necessary to approach carefully when sparring, not because he was aggressive or reckless, because the Force moved through him with a completeness and a freedom that expressed itself in his blade work the way it expressed itself in everything else he did, making him present in the fight in a way that trained practitioners with more formal backgrounds found almost impossible to anticipate or prepare for. Before going further into who he became, it is worth spending a moment on the specific nature of the obstacles he faced as he rebuilt, because the obstacles were not ordinary in any sense of the word, and the fact that he faced them without institutional support, without a council of senior masters to advise him, without the accumulated resource base of an established order, and in many cases without any precedent to draw on for guidance, is what makes the achievement real rather than inherited. The reborn Emperor Palpatine, resurrected in a clone body and carrying a Force connection that had been fed by decades of dark side practice and dark side ritual, nearly destroyed everything Luke had managed to build in its earliest and most fragile stage. He faced this while simultaneously fighting to prevent his own fall to the darkness that Palpatine was actively working to engineer in him, and while carrying the knowledge that the darkness Palpatine represented was not simply a personal threat, but an existential one for the galaxy that had only just begun to find its way out of the Imperial era. He faced it without cracking. The Hand of Thrawn crisis, which combined the tactical genius of one of the Empire's greatest military minds with Force user threats and political crises that would have paralyzed a less comprehensively capable individual, required Luke to function simultaneously as a Jedi Master, a political advisor, a combat operative, and a strategist across multiple theaters. His Force perception allowed him to synthesize information from those multiple theaters in real time in ways that would have been impossible for someone operating through conventional awareness alone. He held it together, Wayland, where he confronted the dark side clone of himself and felt what it actually meant to have your own darkness reflected back at you in a form that had been set free from every choice that had kept that darkness in check across your entire life. was perhaps the most personal test the Force ever placed in front of him. He walked into that confrontation knowing what it was. He came out of it intact, and what he understood about himself afterward went deeper than what he had understood going in. The Yuuzhan Vong invasion, which the Force itself seemed to have almost no access to. The invaders existing in a kind of Force absence that stripped Jedi of the primary tool they relied on for situational awareness and combat effectiveness, required Luke to find ways to lead and to fight and to guide his students through a conflict that had been specifically, if not intentionally, designed to neutralize everything that made a Jedi a Jedi. He adapted. He found the Yuuzhan Vong in the Force, where they did exist, in the suffering they caused, and the living world they moved through. And he used that access point to rebuild operational capability in conditions that should have made it impossible. He felt the dark side's pull throughout his career, more directly and more persistently than most of his students understood, because his capacity for the Force was not one-sided. The same quality of his connection that made him the most powerful light side practitioner of his era also meant the dark side could reach him with a clarity that it could not reach practitioners with a narrower or more constrained channel. He knew this about himself. He had always known it. From the cave on Dagobah, where he had seen his own face in a place of darkness. From the Emperor's throne room, where the Sith had tried to collapse the gap between what he was and what they wanted him to be. His immunity to the dark side's pull was not immunity. It was the daily choice, repeated across decades, to orient himself back toward the light every time the connection he carried pulled in other directions. That choice, made consistently across 40 years of a life that provided it with every possible reason to break, is the foundation everything else was built on. When Abeloth emerged, the ancient being of darkness and chaos who had been imprisoned since before the history of the Jedi tradition began, it was Luke Skywalker who led the Force that contained her, not through conventional Force combat alone. Through an understanding of what she was and what the Force required to address her that drew on everything he had learned. Everything his father had taught him through the manner of his death. Everything Yoda had transmitted from 9 centuries of accumulated wisdom. Everything Qui-Gon had discovered and passed forward through the chain of teachers and students. Everything Revan had intuited about the Force's full nature that the old order had declined to incorporate. All of it came together in him because he was the person in whom all those threads had the space to exist simultaneously. He was the son of the Chosen One. He was the student of 2 of the greatest Jedi the Order had produced. He was the heir of a philosophical tradition reaching back 36,000 years to the first Force users who had gathered on Tython. He was the rebuild of something that had been destroyed and the beginning of something that had never existed before. And he was, across the full span of what the Legends continuity records about his life and his work and his understanding of the Force, the most powerful Jedi in the history of the galaxy. Not because of his midi-chlorian count, though his inheritance from Anakin Skywalker made that count extraordinary. Not because of any single feat in combat or any single moment of extraordinary Force demonstration, though those moments existed and were documented and were remarkable by any standard, but because of the totality, because of what you get when you take the widest channel for the Force a mortal being had inherited in the tradition's history, and you fill it with 9 centuries of accumulated Jedi wisdom transmitted person to person, and you add the specific and unrepeatable understanding of someone who grew up with the Force as something personal rather than institutional, who learned it through love and loss rather than through curriculum, who built his entire career out of the willingness to keep choosing the light in conditions specifically designed to make that choice impossible. The Force does not produce this combination often. It may not have produced it before. Across the full sweep of everything the Jedi tradition built, and everything it lost, and everything the Force moved through in the tens of thousands of years of that tradition's history, the particular configuration that was Luke Skywalker stands alone. Every name on this list earned its place. Every one of them pushed the ceiling. Every one of them demonstrated something that expanded what the people around them believed a Force user could be or do or become. The Jedi tradition is built out of exactly these figures. These moments when one person's complete commitment to the Force and to what the Force was asking of them produced something the tradition had to grow to contain. What joins all of them, from Obi-Wan's unreachable serenity to Qui-Gon's lonely vision, to Bastila's terrible gift, to Mitra's impossible survival, to Mace's purple blade, to Nomi's wall of light, to Exar Kun's devouring ambition, to Revan's comprehensive understanding, to Anakin's necessary sacrifice, to Yoda's 900 years of quiet practice, to everything Luke Skywalker built from the pieces of all that came before, is the Force itself, always present, always moving, choosing its instruments with a patience and a precision that only reveals itself fully in retrospect, when you can finally see the whole shape of what was being built. That is the story of the most powerful Jedi in all of history. Not a tidy ranking of abilities, not a competition where the winner gets a crown. A map of what the Force looks like when it moves through people who have given themselves to it completely, across different eras and different circumstances and different understanding of what giving yourself to something completely even means. What you carry away from this list, if you carry anything, should be the variety of it. The Force did not produce one type of greatness. It produced Obi-Wan's unreachable inner stillness and Qui-Gon's solitary philosophical courage. It produced Bastila's devastating gift and the weight that gift placed on everything she tried to be. It produced Mitra's survival of the unsurvivable and the new kind of Force sensitivity she brought back from the other side of that survival. It produced Mace Windu's purple blade and the extraordinary discipline required to keep what that blade demanded of its user from consuming the user entirely. It produced Nomi Sunrider rising from a roadside ambush to help wall an ancient darkness inside a stone temple that held it for millennia. It produced Exar Kun's terrible genius and the warning his story carries for everyone who comes after him. It produced Revan, the widest Force user the Old Republic ever saw, who walked both sides and came back and built a philosophy from what he found there. It produced Anakin Skywalker, made by the Force for a specific purpose and willing in the final moment to pay the full price of that purpose. It produced 900 years of Yoda, quiet and patient and endlessly deepening. And it produced Luke Skywalker, in whom all of it converged and found its fullest expression. The Force does not promise any of this to the people it moves through. It does not guarantee that the gifts it gives will be received cleanly or used wisely, or that the lives built around those gifts will be comfortable or long or recognized in their time. What it does is choose its instruments with a precision that becomes clear only in retrospect, and trust those instruments with more than they sometimes think they can carry, and remain present in the space between what a person is and what they are capable of becoming. Every Jedi on this list found that space. Every one of them lived in it. And the galaxy was different because they did. That is all the Force ever asks of anyone. And in some exceptional cases, which are the cases this list has spent its time on, it turns out to be more than enough. Rest well. Let the story settle. The Force is with you. It has been all along.